Hey, Bill Watson here. Hope you're enjoying these podcasted Bible studies that we've arranged to conduct. You know, the Church of God International has always intended to try to utilize as much of the technology that we have and different methods and tactics that it provides to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And podcasting is really a very valid and legitimate method in utilizing the technologies that are at our disposal. However, podcasting does have its limitations, as you well know. Unlike webcasting, you can't really interact in real time. So what we've done, we've made arrangements whereby you can ask questions or make comments and send them to us via email. That's right, all you've got to do is go ahead and email us at billw@cgi.org, and hopefully this is going to enhance the educational value of the subject that we're covering as we go through the topics in a more specific way, being directed by your questions and your comments. So let's go ahead now, prepare to go back into the book that we're studying, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions. Just email us. Remember, email us at billw@cgi.org.
Okay, what we're going to do here today is try to get into chapter 2. I was mentioning a little bit at the outset, we're going to be introduced now to the first time Daniel is going to introduce us to some prophecy from a dream that Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, had. I don't know if we're going to get to chapter 2, and that's what I want to give you all a heads up, because there's some prerequisites that I want to kind of lay down as some guidelines so that as we proceed through the book of Daniel, you can use these as references. I don't know if you want to take some notes or what, but it is pretty important that you always view prophecy with these, what I guess you could say, underscoring guidelines, and it'll help you to be able to formulate how to digest the information, because it'll give you some principles to always use as references to help you better understand. And the reason I say that is because so often people in dealing with prophecy take liberties where they shouldn't, end up basically assigning certain labels to certain items in the Bible by taking liberties arbitrarily to do what they believe to be the theology of the issue or to fit their narrative. And we don't want to do that. That's not really the way to deal with prophecy. It's a very disingenuous way. It's wrong, and quite frankly, we have no business as human beings to take the liberty to assign certain meanings to certain things in prophetic writ arbitrarily. And sadly, too much of that goes on today. I mean, this is why we've got confusion already, as I referenced in the sermon, with respect to this alleged rapture happening on 9/23 of this year of 2017, September 23rd, 2 days after the Feast of Trumpets on the 21st, because somebody gets it in their head that they're going to take opportunity to start assigning certain labels to what Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2 state and lay out, which in fact they use no biblical premise, no biblical prerequisite, no biblical information to lay down justification for using the labels or assigning the meanings they assign to those particular things located there in Revelation verses 1 and 2. So it goes to illustrate, certainly it does take some prudence, and I think that's a good word, prudence in looking at prophecy, so that we don't over-exaggerate, so that we don't chase rabbits down wrong holes, come up with wrong ideas due to misinformed or misappropriated premises. So it's really important we take this slow, and I, in lieu of the fact of going through this, is exactly what I want to do. I want to go through the book of Daniel slowly. Because in the book of Daniel, we're not going to know everything. I'll tell you right on the bat right now, we're not going to know all of the things that are in the book of Daniel, because it is a big book, a broad book. It's a deep book. And there are some things, as you will see here as we go through this, that frankly, unless we are in God's timeline at a certain point, because He reserves the sovereign right to reveal what He wants to reveal on a military basis, a need-to-know, a need-to-know basis. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And if we don't need to know right now in the 21st century at this particular decade, X, Y, and Z, guess what? X, Y, and Z is not going to be known by this generation. And that's just the facts. And we've got to be mature enough to say, you know what, I don't know. It could be this, it could be that, but even if we say it could be this and it could be that, that'll get you a cup of coffee and a donut, because that's really not a whole lot of substance there in terms of actually having something definitive to sink our teeth into so that we might be able to recognize something that we might see coming at us. So it's important, I think, we take some time to lay down some of these prerequisites. But before we do that, I just want to kind of review a little bit of Daniel chapter 1, where in looking at this chapter, just a few high points to bring back to our attention, and noticing also some of these points that I really didn't take time to emphasize, but I do want to now in reiterating just a few items. In verse 2, for instance, chapter 1, I want you to take note that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the Lord gave, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with part of the vessels of the house of God. In other words, God gave Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 1 is Nebuchadnezzar. He's the object, and he was the one that God conceded Jehoiakim and the nation of Judah into his hands. We saw in the narrative that we referenced in the sermon today that the reason for that was because God was not going to give a pass to Judah. He was dead-eyed determined he was not going to pardon Judah for its transgressions under Manasseh. It was just too horrible. Had to hold him accountable. And God wanted to hold him accountable. But he did allow Josiah to die in peace and not see the destruction that was to come and that was indeed promised to happen. And it did, of course, come under Jehoiakim's rule and commenced, remember, three invasions. They were 605 in 605, and they were also in 590 something, 98, 97, I think we mentioned, and also in 587, 586. Those three particular invasions. The first invasion, Daniel went to Babylon. The second invasion, Ezekiel went, River Kibar. Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem. In Palestine, you've got three servants of God in three different locations, serving in three different roles, involved and executing three different ministries. Some are interpreting visions and receiving prophecies in dreams. Others are just receiving prophecies and dreams. And Jeremiah also not only receiving certain prophecies in dreams, but in addition, actually talking to the current and present generation of Jews that were being attacked. So Jeremiah has an element of history associated with him too. Now we're going to be going back and forth here, as you're going to see as we thread through this book of Daniel, into certain areas of Chronicles, and we'll be going into Kings, and we'll be going into Jeremiah, even a little bit of Ezekiel later on, because all these guys were alive at the same time, and they all overlap in their writings. And again, it goes back, and I always, because I fell for this too, one man, God only works through one man at a time. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. God works through multiple men at any time he chooses to do so for whatever purposes he chooses to do so, and puts those guys in roles due to their gifts and their abilities and talents predicated on what he wants them to do to, or to forewarn whomever he's looking for them to involve themselves with. So keep that in mind. Here in verse 10, I want you to notice that now God had brought, verse 9, Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking the children which are with your sort? Meaning there was more than just the four lads that Daniel was associated with. The other three, of course, that we know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But he says here, then shall you make me endanger my own head. So this particular eunuch was a little bit concerned about his own neck, so to speak, and didn't want necessarily himself to be at risk, so he's trying to talk to Daniel about his own concerns. But I want to point out in verse 9, very important element here, and that is that God moved on the heart of this guy. Verse 9, now God brought Daniel into favor of tender love, meaning compassion or pity or mercy. So it was this guy being actually moved by God as he looked at Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego to say, you know, these guys, I feel sorry for them. You know, I really feel, my heart goes out to you guys. And of course, God was involved in this event here that we certainly can see by virtue of the words that are written and is brought to our attention with that very fact. Now, in verse 20, we read about all the matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And I want you to point out here, verse 21, Daniel continued even unto the first year of the king of Cyrus. So here we have now the timeline. So historically speaking, this is important to grasp and to put this in context so we know where we are contextually in the unfolding of this history. And that is, we're in the 70-year period of captivity that essentially Judah experienced under the hands of the Babylonians. And we're going all the way up to the end of Daniel's life, because most scholars, most commentaries will tell you he died right when Cyrus came into rule at around 537, 538 BC. And that's when Cyrus came into play and essentially took charge of Babylon and the Medes and the Persians. And then a year later, after that occurred, Cyrus gave his edict, the famous edict of rebuilding the temple, and under Ezra and Nehemiah, the books there that are written, the Jews went back, about 40,000 of them or so, just enough to fill the Cleveland Stadium, by the way. They went back to the Palestine there to rebuild the second temple, of which was now the stage setting for the Messiah, for Jesus' original incarnation to come physically to the earth and die as our Savior. So all of this is kind of working in play, and in chapter 1 we've come to realize that, number one, God was favorable. We understand God was favorable, number one, to the 4 boys, Daniel and his 3 buddies. Secondly, that they enjoyed favor with their captors, and it was due to God's actual intervention. He moved on the hearts of these guys. Supernaturally, he was involved, intervening via an angel, whatever, we don't know, certainly it leaves, questions in our mind as to how it actually occurs that happens, but we know he moved on Pharaoh's heart, did he not? He moved on Pharaoh's heart, he hardened it, and then Pharaoh would change his mind, and then he'd, soften it, and Pharaoh would say go, and then he hardened it again, So we understand that God intervenes, and I think that's important from the standpoint of recognizing that God is very interactive with mankind, because I've often said this, it's a little play on words, but it's true. It's his story. It's history. It's his story. And so therefore it's his prerogative. He has the sovereign right to choose when he's going to involve himself, in what way, to make an adjustment on the course, if necessary. Whether it's to throttle something back, whether it's to push something forward, whether it's to block something and deflect, he himself, and you can see this throughout the course of the Bible, historically speaking, and we're going to see some of these things as we go along in detail, these little nuances, to illustrate to all of us just how dynamic, how powerful this word is, and how validating, how true it is in terms of the actual events that occurred, and of which you can historically prove actually indeed happened back then. Now, the third item is that these were young men of faith, and they were young men of faith and were recognized by virtue of the fact of keeping God first in their lives. Daniel chapter 1, the whole issue was around not wanting to eat something that was either unclean or common. So consequently, it was either actually unclean or it was used in some kind of offering procedure or ritual to some pagan god that made it ceremonially unclean. Most likely the wine being used in the ceremonies of the pagan worshiping of Diana and the moon gods Nebo and all of those probably was in their minds tainted, and so they even refused the wine, because we know wine's not unclean. You can drink wine. I mean, even if it's bad wine, you can drink it if you want. It's only grapes. But the bottom line was they didn't want to drink it. And why didn't they want to drink it? Well, it was probably ceremonially unclean in that regard. So they were men of faith, and they were men of faith and recognized for it because God saw that they put Him first in their lives. Now, before we get into 2, I want to take some moments here to go through these prerequisites that I want to share with all of you, because I think it's important that we lay down some guidelines to be able to digest these prophecies as we get to them, because we're going to hit a prophecy in chapter 2, we're going to hit another prophecy in chapter 7, we're going to hit another one in chapter 8, we're going to hit another one in chapter 9, I think, and 11 for sure. So we're going to be hitting some major prophecies as we go deeper and deeper into this book. So these are prerequisites that you want to use this as a paradigm for your own ability to digest the information from, and so you can vet it a bit clearer and a bit better for yourself. So understand point number 1, prophecy is indeed history in advance. It is indeed history in advance. It's a predetermined timeline of events that God, here's the key, that God has defined. Now this is why I often say God has written a script. And He said, "Thus saith the Lord, this is going to happen." And whatever that might be, it's written in here that it's going to happen. And that's why I've often said that in essence, because God put it in writing and He doesn't lie, He's painted Himself kind of into a corner so that He's got no alternative. That if indeed it's a conditional prophecy, if conditions change, He's got a way out because it's conditional. But if it's unconditional, if it's no way, Jose, no matter what you do, this is what's going to happen, well then guess what? He's in a corner. He's got no way out except, boom, do it. He's got to come forward and get it done. So prophecy, remember, is indeed history in advance. Now there are conditional prophecies, of course, and there are certain ones that there may be a way out based on certain reactions and or responses of those that those prophecies are relating to. But with again, the principle stands. There is a prerequisite that God has laid down that if these conditions are not met, then X is going to happen. Y is going to happen. C is going to happen. And so it's important we understand that. And that in the specific case, it is basically in this particular case, the course of Babylon's history and exactly where these prophecies are going to go and take Babylon. Remember, what we are doing here is we're commencing and actually entering into a time for the first time in the history of the world that no nation of Israel exists. There is no defined nation of Israel. There are a lot of people, still Jews and so on, and most commentators will tell you that not everybody did get taken off to Babylon. There were still some Jews scattered over the hills of Judea and so on. Still had some, and archaeological findings in the cylinders of Babylon and so on prove the fact that some of these little towns and villages and so forth that were made up of Jews were not really disturbed by the Babylonians because they didn't really present any military threat. They were farmers and field people and just citizens, that had rakes and shovels. What are they going to do to trained military Babylonian soldiers? So a lot of them were left undone, and to prove that, a lot of the archaeological finds in the Babylonian cylinders, which is what they call these archaeological finds, proved this fact because they're recorded that there was still trading going on and still bartering going on and so on, the record and the history back at this time in this particular part of it. But the bottom line is that this marks the beginning of the end of days, and the scenario that now is going to unfold, that God is going to lay out, can then be tracked and traced, validated and affirmed, so that you know that what is written in here was written before it happened, so that when it happens, you know God was involved. And you can validate it by actual history. And so we're going to go through, being now in the 21st century on the AD side of the aisle. We've got that proverbial Monday night quarterbacking advantage where we can look back in the tunnel of history as opposed to being here alive in 550, 598, 605 BC, where we're actually in the fight, we're in the forest, we can't see the trees because it's, we have no context of yet what this future is, because all we're going to see here, as you'll see in chapter 2, is a dream of an image that's going to come into play here with this the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. But putting that to the side for right now, this is very important then to grasp, and that is that number one, prophecy is indeed history in advance. Now, also, secondly, prophecy can be understood. It can be understood. Maybe not all the details will be understood at this time, because as I've already said, it's God's prerogative to reserve the sovereign right to release information as He sees fit and deems necessary for that generation. And brethren, if it's not useful, and I'm going to show you some scriptures here in a minute, if it's not useful for that generation to know a certain event, about a certain event, the truth about a certain event, guess what? That generation is not going to know it. There are prophecies, we're going to see this in a minute, that Daniel did not understand what he was writing. He was blank. Sicker than a dog. Went through a lot of cogitations, throwing up and all this stuff. He was sick and didn't understand a word that he wrote. As a matter of fact, he was even told by some of the visitations that he experienced, shut it up. It's not for your time. What? I went through all that, you put me through all that pain. I want to know, Enquirer magazine. But it wasn't meant to know, and so consequently, he didn't get a chance to know. We have a booklet. I wanted to present a little unsolicited advertisement here called Can You Understand Bible Prophecy? I strongly recommend you go ahead and perhaps get it. It's free of charge, no cost at all, again, if you haven't had a chance to get it. And also, let me recommend the Daniel Controversy, an Armor of God program. It's on our website. All you got to do is go to the CGI.org, go across to the drop-downs, Armor of God, hit on Armor of God, you'll drop down, you'll see Armor of God Archives, hit on Armor of God Archives, all of the Armor of Gods will come up. The one you're looking for is dated 5/28/17. 5/28/17. It's called Daniel Controversy by Mike James, 5/28/17. There's another one, second one I'd like you to also have time to take a look at, and you might want to watch, and that is titled Can We Understand Prophecy? It's another Armor of God. Can We Understand Prophecy? It's dated 9/11/16. 9/11/16. It's done by me, and you can watch it there. It's archived, 9/11/16. This too will give you some background on this second point with regard to understanding prophecy. Now let me just give you an example here, Daniel chapter 7, and in verse 28. Daniel just went through the four beasts. You, I'm sure, are somewhat familiar with the descriptions of those beasts in verses 3 through about 8. And then, of course, the interpretation of the fourth beast in more detail, commencing in 17 through the end of the chapter. In verse 28, it ends with, hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me. He got sick. But I kept the matter in my heart. No indication here he understood anything of what he was talking about, other than the fact that he got sick, and he remembered what he saw, because this was a vision to him. This was not a dream from someone else. You'll read in verse 1 there of this chapter 7, it was a dream, it was his vision. God gave him this vision. So he saw these things, but he kept the matter to himself in all due respect, and most likely because he didn't understand it. Look at it in chapter 8, verse 27. Again, he goes down through these two animals that represent certain empires that we understand to be the Greeks, the Grecian Empire, the Macedonian, and the Medes and the Persians. But be that as it may, we'll get to that later. I just want to focus on verse 27 again, just to illustrate my point here. And that is in verse 27, he says, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business." He went about his own, his normal course of business. "And I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it." He didn't understand it. He was just a conduit to write it down, record it. It's not for you to understand. Don't worry about it. Get about your business. It's need-to-know basis. God is very structured. He's very methodic. All these guys like Harold Camping who claims, Christ is going to return in April of whatever year that was, 2013, and then he missed the date, so he's moved it to October. People were spending $250,000 to buy these advertisements along the road and, claiming that the rapture was going to occur at this time. And lo and behold, even in spite of the scriptures saying that nobody knows the day or the hour, people were believing, and you think to yourself, how can they do that in light of the scripture? Well, guess what? Some people have pretty convincing ways of talking their way into your mind and into your head and get you to believe certain things that are not in your Bible. And we've got perfect proof of that all over the place. We could cite Christians who believe Christmas is Jesus' birthday and Easter is Resurrection Day and all the things that just, those two simple things that go along with so many other things, the immortality of the soul and the Trinity, and on it goes. So the bottom line is, don't ever sell yourself short and think that you're above being deceived. You're not. Things are going to get so bad. Remember Matthew 24? Things are going to get so bad that even the very elect could be deceived. You remember those scriptures. So that's why today in the sermon, it merits our attention to stay focused, to stay vigilant, watch, be on your game, be on your toes. Somebody starts saying this, that, and the other thing, and there are things that are encroaching in our Sabbath-keeping culture too. There's a movement going on right now that they claim that the United States of America is the beast. So if I came up to you and said, can you disprove it? We need to be vigilant. We need to give a reason why we have the hope within us. Why do you believe that the beast is not the United States of America? Because many people say, well, look how great the beast is going to be. Look at how it's going to be such a benefactor to the world. Well, who's the benefactor of the world? Who's so great right now? And you take it into the context of that and put it in that framing and then take it from that point of view. And guess what? You've got a lot of evangelicals and now even a few scattered Sabbatarians beginning to pick up on this. There's even a little bit of a movement claiming that the United States is the place of safety based on Jeremiah chapter 30 and Jacob's troubles, where it describes that I will save you out of this, meaning the destruction and so forth that is intended to come on Jacob, if you understand who Jacob is, and the fact that because God's going to save him out of it, that America is the place of safety, because there are some who believe that America is the land of Jacob, which it is. But when you look at Jeremiah 30 and you put it in context, what it's talking about is when David is resurrected, I will bring you out of it. Oh, when is David resurrected? At the beginning of the millennium. At the beginning of the millennium. So you gotta think of these continuums. You got to keep all these little dots on the board so that you don't get tripped up. And as you put these dots on the board, you draw lines to them. And if you can't draw a line to them, be patient. Let the dot stay there, because you got the dot at least identified. And if you can't draw a line to it, don't worry about it. We'll get to it, perhaps, if our generation is intended to get to it. Daniel wasn't even allowed really to get to some of the meanings, as we see here in just these few scriptures that we're referencing. Look at chapter 12, Daniel chapter 12. Here's another example. Again, talking about prophecy can be understood, but again, it's God's prerogative to provide that understanding when He chooses. And here in Daniel 12, verse 4, God again is very clear as He gives Daniel some thoughts to consider. Verse 4, but you, O Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book, even to the time of the end, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, and one on the side of the bank of the river, and the other on the other side of the bank of the river. And he got distracted with the angels. But the point of here is that Daniel was instructed to shut the book up until the time of the end. So everything again, going through the whole chapter 11 through chapter 12, 1 through about 3, which is the longest, one of the longest, is the longest, you could say, prophecy in the Bible next to the book of Revelation. Daniel was told, sorry, can't understand it, Nathaniel. It's not the time. Just write it down. Just write it down. Don't worry about it. It's not until the time of the end. Over here, and just drop down to a few more verses here in verse 8. And I heard, but I understood not. That is what these angels were talking about in the scriptures preceding. I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel. The words are closed up, sealed, till the time of the end. And of course, verse 13. But go your way till the end be, for you shall rest, meaning you shall die, and stand in your lot at the end of the days. So Daniel was really cut out of a lot of what he wrote. He went to his grave really not knowing what he wrote. He was writing about animals. He knew certain limited information because he recognized, as we will see, certain things with regard to Babylon. But even at that, he was in chapter 7. You'll find when the dream that he gets, the vision he gets, shifts. He's a bit confused. So he just kind of lists like a scribe what he saw. And what I want to illustrate to you in this regard is that it is very important that we then understand that in understanding prophecy, if we're going to understand it and have a perspective of understanding it, the apodolismatic principle needs to be applied. That's number 3. The apodolismatic principle, A-P-O-T-E-L, apodolismatic, A-P-O-T-E-L-E-S-M-A-T-I-C, the apodolismatic principle. Now, what in the world is that? And that's just a big religious word. What it's talking about, the apodolismatic principle, is simply we understood it, or we were essentially told it over the years as duality. But it's more than just duality. It's more than just duality. It is also multiplicity of application. Let me read you this definition. And that's why I'd like you to see that Armor of God program, Can We Understand Prophecy? It goes into detail about this particular principle, which is so very important to understand when you're understanding prophecy. For instance, here, this is the meaning of the apodolismatic principle. Quote, this principle affirms a prophecy fulfilled or partially fulfilled or unfulfilled at the appointed time may have a latter fulfillment or a reoccurring fulfillment or may have a consummated fulfillment. You can get that same definition when you watch the program, so you don't need to write that down now if you don't want to. But point being is it's considering duality, multiplicity of application. It also goes to context. It goes to the fact of reading from the present context and considering. This is something people don't do. I'm going to show you some scriptures here in a minute. We're going to just take a little exercise here to show you what I'm talking about. But understanding the timeline of when these prophets lived, is real critical in understanding who and what they're talking to at the time they're talking. And of which, when you look at it from their point of view in their time, that's why it's important for you to find out when they lived and when they died, then you can know that if indeed what's happening around them, because let's face it, Jeremiah was living in a time of what? War. They were being invaded by Babylon. Ezekiel was living in a time of war. They were being invaded by Babylon. Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, all of them were living in a time of war while Babylon was attacking them. So when you start reading their narratives, you have to begin to understand, does it make sense that with what they're experiencing and what he's writing would apply to their time? That's a key. That's applying a apocalyptic principle. Putting yourself there and then asking yourself, does that make sense that they would be experiencing this then, or is it to be extrapolated out for another time? And like in a dream fashion, the prophet is addressing, maybe sometimes in and out of the present into the future, which makes it even more difficult. And that's how you got to follow this apocalyptic principle through this narration sometimes. But the point of it is that there are indeed times and opportunities to apply this. Case in point, and I won't turn there, I'm going to turn to something else, but I will reference this with regard to Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Jesus said that the time is coming when one stone will not rest on another, pointing to the temple when he was on the Mount of Olives there in those 3 chapters. And that's where he was. He was talking to his disciples. And they said, tell us when, tell us when. And he said, well, this is when it's going to happen. And guess what? Well, some 35 years after Christ ascended, 40 years after Christ ascended back to the Father, that temple was razed. It was flattened by Titus when he rolled into Jerusalem. All intents and purposes, you would think, that prophecy's fulfilled. It's done. It's over. But when you get down into the nuances of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, you see that there are discussions of items that are not and were not fulfilled. They were not fulfilled. Christ did not return. He did not collect his Christians from all the 4 corners of the earth and all that, and land. He did not set up world-ruling government. All the things that were basically said that many people reference were fulfilled, and then they try to explain to you that the whole chapter 24, the whole chapter Mark 13, the whole chapter Luke 21 is fulfilled. When you get them into the details, it devolves into nonsense. It devolves into nonsense. Now, there are people, Christians, that are called preterists. You've heard me talk about them before. They're called preterists. Preterists are people who believe that there is no prophetic value anymore to this book. Some will go as far as saying the only prophetic value of this book is Revelation 21 and 22. Even the whole book of Revelation is fulfilled. Every bit of it, except for Revelation 21 and 22. And these are Christians. These are Christians, liberal Christians, but nevertheless. And they will tell you that the only value is historical. This is all historical, and we're supposed to learn from history so that we don't repeat the history. And therefore, that's where the value is of your Bible. And in all due respect, it goes much further than that, obviously, much beyond that particular representation. Look at Daniel 7, for instance. Let's just go to Daniel 7, and here we see Daniel 7 listing these these animals, okay? And these animals are what they are. There's a lion, a bear, a leopard with 4 heads. Okay, we've got that down. We've got that. But this animal turns up in Revelation. Keep your finger in Daniel 7. Go to Revelation 13. This animal represents, we understand, empires. And we'll get to that later. But when Daniel was writing these animals down, he didn't have a clue. He was just writing them down. And then some 600 years later, the Apostle John on the Isle of Patmos, where he was exiled, gets this vision called Revelation, Apocalypse, the revealings, not of the Apostle John, but the revealings of Jesus Christ. That's who they are, the revealings of. And for those of you who are interested in this, and that's why I say it would be very timely for you to watch that Wednesday night Bible study that Adrian's putting on with regard to the book of Revelation, because they play with each other so much at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. But here you read, lo and behold, look at this, the 10 crowns, the leopard, the bear, the lion, and you have it describing a profile of the beast. So now we've got some insight. Now we've got some scripture that if we put a dot on the board, and like the FBI does or the CIA when they're trying to profile serial killers, I've often used this little analogy because the beast is a serial killer. It's guilty of killing millions of people on planet Earth. It's a serial killer. So if we want to profile this thing, we've got scripture here, evidence. I don't have to make anything up. You don't have to make anything up. We can literally feel good about recognizing some underscoring evidence that affords us to connect some dots, to actually draw lines. We can actually draw some lines. And that's the key. See, the more lines we can draw, the more focused the picture becomes. The unfortunate part is we don't have a whole lot of lines drawn yet, but we're making our way. We're better off in the 21st century than we were in the 19th, 18th, and 16th century. But my point is here, these are scriptures, and this is apostolematic principles that we're utilizing. We're extrapolating here and applying to a future situation. And then again, one more time, because guess what? When John received Revelation 13, you know it as well as I do, that was 2,000 years ago. We're still in the game. We're still rolling along the track. So now we got to extrapolate this out to our time. And how far beyond? I don't know. I don't know. But I do know this. There are some dots in here that have me very disturbed from the standpoint of timeline, because they are legitimate dots of consideration in a day and age, pragmatically, that all of us in this room know could literally today, with the weapons of mass destruction that exist on this planet, destroy everything that's alive. That's a major benchmark of achievement that mankind has hit, that allows for and provides a means by which some of this stuff that's described in here now, in our day and age, can be achieved, accomplished, executed. This guy, in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, what's he going to do? He shot a missile here just the other day, again, over the northern sector of Japan. Air raid sirens blew. That missile flew 478 miles in the air. That means it went into outer space, 478 miles in the air. I think, if I recall, the space station's only 250 miles, I think. I don't think it's even 300 miles, the space station. So it went beyond the space station, so that there's no gravity pull. Therefore, that's why those missiles can fly so fast, because there's no drag of gravity. They can, once the ballistic missile is up and it goes above the atmosphere, it is on a move. And whatever it's programmed to, whether it be a city in U.S. or a city in Russia or wherever, it gets there quick. Half hour, 45 minutes, around the world. It's moving because it's in outer space. Point being, we've got that technology. So that's unnerving in many regards, and does indeed present a very plausible consideration in terms of the time and day and age that we're living in. Here's another perfect example of a paralysmatic principle in play, over here in Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah 14. And in verse 1, we have, verse 4. Let's just drop down to verse 4 for the sake of time. You shall take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. And so now we think we're talking about Babylon. But like in a dream, we shift. And all of a sudden, in verse 12, how are you fallen, O Lucifer in the Latin, or in the Hebrew, Halelo, the light giver, the light provider, the demon of all demons, in this particular case. And then we shift to Satan, and then we come back out. And you have a similar situation in Ezekiel chapter 28 with the prince of Tyre being labeled, but then going into this description of Satan Meaning, of course, and certainly implicit of, the fact that maybe Satan was indeed in these kings, that he was there, near them, giving them proper, or as far as he's concerned, proper instruction for what he wanted to weave in terms of the narrative he was trying to accomplish and achieve where he was at that time in history of humankind. So this is another form of this principle in action. Now let me show you one simple one here in Micah. I want to show you another application of how this applies. Micah chapter 4. Many of you are familiar with this. This is clearly about the last days. Micah chapter 4. It says, verse 1, but in the last days. So we're in the last days. It says, but in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the tops of the mountains. And we understand that again, and we'll get to this in a moment in regards to point 4 being symbology and poetic descriptions. But here's a perfect example of poetic and symbolic utilization of words, because mountains are nations and so on. We understand that because, again, the Bible interpreting itself. In verse 2 it says, and many nations shall come and say, come and let us go to the mountain of the Lord, the nation of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob. He'll teach us of his ways, and we'll walk in his paths. And essentially we get a description of the millennium. You've probably heard this read, the Feast of Tabernacles, many, many times over the years with respect to describing the millennium. But then notice as we continue on, in verse 6, in that day, what day? These last days. That's what we're talking about. That's the context. In that day, says the Lord, I will assemble her and halt, and I will gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted, and I will make her that halted a remnant, and her that was cast far off strong nations, and the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. Still talking then about the millennium in that day, and we're talking about God ruling from Zion. And then he ends here with verse 8, and you, O tower of flock, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, unto thee shall it come, even the first dominion, the kingdom shall come to the daughter of Jerusalem. So it's going to be a great and grand time during that millennial rule when God finally does subdue all nations, okay? But now watch. Verse 9. Verse 9. Now, stop for a moment. When did Micah live? Who's he talking to? That's important for understanding the narrative that we're about to enter into. Micah was a prophet to the 10 tribes. Micah lived about 100 plus years before Jeremiah. So Micah was alive before Babylon invaded Judah. Micah was alive during the Assyrian invasion into the northern 10 tribes. Now, that's the context. That's the timeline. So we put Micah 120 years before Jeremiah. So this is Daniel, Jeremiah. We're not there. We're talking about Micah up here, 120 years before. So here comes now, let's put us there. Let's put ourselves there. We're reading from that perspective. He says this, now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Is your counselor perished? For pangs have taken you as a woman in travail. Yeah, the northern 10 tribes at this time were suffering from the fourth invasion of the Assyrian kings, Sennacherib and so forth. People were being hauled off. The houses were being burned. The women were being raped. The kids were being beheaded. The Assyrian army were like the Nazis of the neighborhood. They were mean, just vicious and brutal people. And they ran roughshod through the northern 10 tribes of Israel, killing literally millions of people, hauling them off into Assyria, up to Nineveh, and so on. And Micah is saying, are you, to Israel, are you afraid because now you have no king? They've lost all their leadership. They're under siege. And Micah's got kind of an attitude, because he's speaking on behalf of God on correction. And so he's saying here, Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail, like going through a birthing process. That's how painful this is. For now shall you go forth out of the city. You shall dwell in the field. You shall go even, look at this, you shall go even to Babylon? Is he seeing beyond the invasion of the Assyrians to ultimately Israel being totally taken out and taken to Babylon? Yeah, this is a prophecy. He didn't even, I mean, this is 120 years before Babylon was even a twinkle in the eye of the Assyrians, because Babylon was nothing more than a regional power at the time within the Assyrian Empire. And at this time, the Assyrians were king of the mountain. There was nobody messing with the Assyrians. They were tough dudes. They were an army well equipped, and they had plenty of sharp swords to take care of business when they wanted to take care of it. And so here you've got this prophet saying this, and he says, there shall be delivered there, the Lord shall redeem you from the hand of your enemies. There shall you be delivered, Babylon. There the Lord shall redeem you from the hand of your enemies. What happened to the Israelites when Cyrus the Mede came? Did they get delivered from Babylon? Yeah, they got delivered from Babylon. Absolutely. What you're reading here is the ultimate play out. In other words, what Micah is saying is, you've got no king. You're going to be taken down, even ultimately to Babylon, but you'll be redeemed and brought out. And guess what? We're going to see that after 70 years of being captive. But this is a prophecy that was spoken 130 years or so before it all happened. And he's bringing it to the ultimate end here by stating, redeem you from the hand of your enemies. Verse 11, now also many nations are gathered against you. Yeah, they are, because with the Assyrians, they had alliances. They had the Moabites, they had the Amorites, they had a lot of people. They had a lot of people. And they were the kings, and they ruled. And so now, Micah says, also many nations are gathered against you, Israel, that say, let her be defiled, and let our eye look upon Zion. But they know not the thoughts of the Lord, neither understand they his counsel. Watch this, brethren. For he shall gather them as the sheaves into the floor. Arise and thresh, trample, that means, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron. I will make your hooves brass. You shall beat in pieces many people. I will consecrate their gain unto the Lord, and their substance unto the Lord of the whole earth. What? We're being taken over, and you're telling me that the time is coming when we're going to have a horn of iron, and we're going to thresh our enemies, and we're going to have our way with people? And we're being taken captive. Our houses are being burned here. My wife has just been killed. My kids are gone. I don't even know where they are. My chariot is burning there. Look at that. There it was. I had 2 chariots in that garage. I got nothing now. What are you talking about, Micah? What are you smoking? We're under siege. You see how this doesn't apply? It doesn't make sense for Micah to even be saying this. If Micah is saying what he's saying, that's a cruel joke. It's really a cruel joke to say that, again, that we're going to have a horn of iron and make the hooves brass, and you shall beat in pieces many people, and I'm going to consecrate you. Chapter 5, verse 1, now gather yourself in troops, O daughter of troops. He has laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon his cheek. Now he shifts to Jesus and talks about the Messiah and about Bethlehem, and talks ultimately how they will win and beat up all of their enemies. He takes this narrative down through, talking about Bethlehem, O you Bethlehem, Ephratah, though you be a little among the thousands, and this is a prophecy of Christ. Therefore will he give them up until the time that she which travails has brought forth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return unto the children of Israel. He shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord. Talking about Christ, this man shall be the peace when the Assyrian representing the enemy, shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds of a number of perfection, and 8 principal men, and they shall waste the land of Assyria. The time's coming. Israel will waste the land of Assyria, and the sword of the land of Nimrod, that's Babylon, Nimrod, Babylon. So the Assyrians and Babylon are both ultimately going to be taken care of by God, and in particular, this Messiah that's going to be born in Bethlehem. And he says, thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads within our borders. In other words, the time is coming, we Israelites will not have to worry about our enemies beating us up, because our Messiah is going to take care of us, and he is going to do what needs to be done to our enemies and protect us. But look at this. You talk about a apostolismatic principle application. Verse 7. How does this apply? And the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people, as the dew from the Lord, as showers upon the grass, that tarries not for man, nor waits for the sons of men. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles, in the midst of many people, as a lion among the beasts of the forest. Very poetic, very metaphoric. As a young lion among the flocks of sheep. So this remnant of Jacob can both be tough, like a lion in the woods, or it can be gentle and play with the sheep. It can be either way, this remnant of Jacob, who's going to be living amongst the beasts of the field. Brethren, this does not apply to Micah. This remnant, the remnant of Israel that Micah's living in during that time was not a remnant, it was a nation. And that nation went down at the hands of the Assyrians. Now, out of that, could a remnant come? Of course. Where's that remnant? See? Now, if you take the fact that that remnant over a period of time, as you understand, a dot on the board, that a great company of nations and a great nation does indeed represent a remnant of the cultures of Israel down in the future, you can see how the United States of America, amongst the beasts of the field, the Gentile nations of the world, is living as was Great Britain and the Commonwealth nations, and they are in and amongst the beasts of the field, and both can act tough. World War I, World War II are both notches on the belts of those cultures, as well as who are the first ones when disasters hit, and can play with the sheep and be gentle and merciful and take care of whatever needs to be taken care of charitably. I don't see it happening from Saudi Arabia. I don't see Russia oftentimes running to the aid of other nations. I'm not sure I understand any bodies of other nations being buried in other nations for defending those countries, as opposed to Americans who are buried in France and buried in Germany and so on and so forth. So you begin to see that a remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people, as dew from the Lord, as showers upon the grass, that tarry not for man, nor wait for the sons of men. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles in the midst of many people, as a lion among the beasts of the forest, and as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who, if he go through both, treads down and tears in pieces, and none can deliver. In other words, if that lion wants to unleash its full power, nobody is going to be able to take care of it. I mean, it's going to have its way with any beast of the field. That's what it's saying. When it gets, that remnant gets to that point, that is a major point. Well, guess what? I wish it would stop right here, but it doesn't. Look at this. Your hand shall be lifted up upon your adversaries. All your enemies